The mid-1950s should have marked a celebratory chapter for Bentley, a brand whose identity had been forged on the back of daring engineering, fierce independence, and the swagger of its little man's victories. Instead, the unveiling of the Bentley S1 Standard Steel Saloon in 1955 sent a shockwave of disappointment through the community of loyalists who had romanticized the Bentley badge as a symbol of unapologetic performance and mechanical purity. But before diving into that, I see 99% of my viewers haven't subscribed yet, so make sure you subscribe this time. For decades, Bentley had cultivated a reputation for building cars that were not merely luxurious, but alive, machines with long bonnets, visceral engine note, and handling that encouraged spirited driving even on imperfect British roads. The enthusiasts who adored the earlier Derby Bentleys or the post-war Mark VI expected the brand to continue evolving that same dynamic lineage. What they received, however, felt like a decorous, muted, overly mannered automobile designed for a very different kind of driver. The S1 appeared grand, yes, and impeccably finished, but it also embodied the softening influence of Rolls-Royce, which now controlled the brand and had begun reshaping Bentley into a more subdued, chauffeur-oriented enterprise. Gone was the raw, energetic personality that once separated Bentley from its corporate sibling. In its place stood a car that seemed almost embarrassed to acknowledge its sporting ancestry. For many long-time owners, this shift was not merely a matter of taste. It felt like an ideological collapse, a surrender of everything Bentley once stood for. Where earlier models carried an aura of rebellious aristocracy, the S1 radiated constraint and conformity, as though every line, every seam, every mechanical choice had been polished until all individuality was erased. Even the driving character betrayed the brand's heritage. Instead of the taut, athletic feel Bentley had been known for, the S1 favored soft, floaty comfort that minimized road feedback rather than celebrating it. The steering was lighter, the suspension more cushioned, and the gear ratios tuned for a smooth, almost sleepy glide rather than rapid bursts of speed. For enthusiasts who cherish Bentley for its bold engineering and motorsport pedigree, the S1 seemed like a deliberate step backward, a retreat from the past rather than an evolution of it. Many criticized the company for abandoning the performance-oriented core that had once differentiated Bentley from the crowd, arguing that the S1 was not just a disappointing car, but a symbol of lost ambition. This feeling of betrayal was amplified by the car's unmistakable resemblance to the Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud. Although Bentley had already been under Rolls-Royce ownership for years, the S1 made the corporate influence impossible to ignore. To critics, the S1 looked like a silver cloud wearing a Bentley grille as an afterthought, a badge-engineered twin masquerading as something more exclusive. The idea that Bentley, once the manufacturer of gritty racing champions, had now become a sporty Rolls-Royce for people who couldn't admit they wanted a Rolls-Royce was a bitter sentiment that echoed through enthusiast circles. Even automotive journalists of the time hinted, ever so politely, that the S1 lacked the muscular identity expected of the marque. And for owners who had followed Bentley's storied rise from the Bentley Boys era to post-war revival, the S1 marked a point where heritage and modernity clashed so sharply that it created a permanent fracture in how the brand was perceived. In short, the hatred for the S1 was not born from mechanical failure or poor craftsmanship. Far from it. Instead, it came from the emotional sting of watching a beloved brand shed its hard-earned personality in favor of corporate uniformity. The car became a symbol of Bentley losing its voice, its swagger, and the uncompromising spirit that once drew admirers from across the world. For many, the S1 was not just a car they disliked. It was a painful reminder of the moment Bentley stopped being the Bentley they adored. One of the deepest wounds inflicted by the Bentley S1 was the abrupt collapse of the coach-building culture that had defined Bentley ownership for decades, a tradition that transformed every car into a rolling piece of art tailored to the buyer's personality. Before the S1 arrived in 1955, purchasing a Bentley meant stepping into a creative dialogue with legendary British and European coach builders, Mulliner, Park Ward, James Young, Hooper, Freestone and Webb, and others, each offering unique silhouettes, roof lines, fender treatments, and cabin layouts that turned every chassis into a one-of-one expression of elegance or performance. Wealthy clients would choose everything from sweeping fastback bodies to razor-edge saloons to flamboyant dropheads, all meticulously hand-shaped in aluminum or steel by craftsmen who treated coachwork like sculpture. This tradition wasn't merely stylistic, it was philosophical. Bentley's identity had always been intertwined with the idea that a customer was not simply buying a car, but commissioning a masterpiece. The car's character emerged from a fusion of engineering excellence and bespoke artistry, a blend that made pre-S1 Bentleys feel alive, personal, and culturally significant. When Bentley announced that the S1 would come primarily as a standard steel saloon, a mass-produced, factory-designed body offered to every buyer in nearly the same configuration, it felt like an assault on the very spirit of Bentley ownership. The shift to standardized bodies did far more than limit aesthetic variety. It turned Bentley into something many purists never expected, a brand that sold uniformity. Instead of elegant design houses shaping the body to match a driver's desires, the S1 delivered a single silhouette stamped out in greater numbers than any Bentley before it. The body panels were no longer individually hand-formed by artisans, but produced in a far more industrial, orchestrated process in partnership with pressed steel. Though the craftsmanship inside remained exquisite, the exterior no longer carried the soul of coach builders who had spent lifetimes perfecting their personal artistic signatures. The S1 looked refined, certainly, but also predictable, its proportions dictated by corporate efficiency rather than artistic exploration. For longtime owners, this felt like watching a bespoke tailor transform overnight into a department store clothing brand. No matter how fine the stitching or luxurious the materials, the loss of individuality was unmistakable and painful. Even worse, the diminishing role of coach builders signaled the erosion of a vibrant creative ecosystem that had grown up around Bentley for decades. Many small coach building houses relied heavily on commissions from wealthy Bentley and Rolls-Royce clients. The introduction of the S1 standardized body effectively strangled this ecosystem, reducing the demand for custom bodies to a trickle. Only a tiny handful of S1 chassis ever received bespoke coachwork, and even those were constructed with increasing limitations because the new corporate philosophy discouraged deviation from the standard saloon design. To enthusiasts, this was not simply a business decision. It was a cultural death sentence. The coach-built Bentley had been a hallmark of British automotive artistry, a symbol of pride in craftsmanship and individuality, and seeing it swept aside in favor of a uniform body shell felt like a historic loss. Moreover, the uniformity of the S1 created a psychological shift in how Bentley was perceived. Where earlier models radiated exclusivity through uniqueness, the S1 introduced a level of sameness that made the brand feel, for the first time, commercially motivated rather than artistically driven. To many, this homogenization diluted Bentley's prestige. A car once celebrated for bespoke elegance had become visually indistinguishable from its Rolls-Royce twin, the Silver Cloud, except for its badge and grille. This convergence not only angered Bentley loyalists but also confused new buyers, some of whom struggled to understand what separated the two brands anymore. In the end, the hatred toward the S1 standard steel body was not a critique of its quality, because the car remained beautifully engineered and meticulously built, but lament for the loss of artistic freedom, individuality, and the poetic collaboration between customer and craftsman that once defined Bentley ownership. The S1 didn't just end an era. It closed the door on a way of life, leaving a passionate community mourning a tradition that could never truly return. The resentment toward the Bentley S1 deepened even further because enthusiasts could not ignore the uncomfortable truth. The S1 felt less like a proudly engineered Bentley and more like a carefully disguised Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud wearing a different grille. For decades, Bentley and Rolls-Royce had operated with a delicate balance, shared engineering underneath, yes, but distinct personalities expressed through different tuning, different bodies, and different philosophies of what a luxury automobile should be. Bentley had always represented the more dynamic, athletic, driver-focused side of luxury, the choice for someone who wanted refinement, but also wanted to feel the mechanical heartbeat of the car responding to every command. Rolls-Royce, by contrast, specialized in serenity and detachment, building cars meant to isolate occupants from the outside world. This duality gave both brands meaning and protected Bentley's identity even under Rolls-Royce ownership. But with the S1, that distinction blurred in a way that shocked purists. Suddenly, it became glaringly obvious that the two marques were no longer evolving along parallel but separate paths. They were converging into a single corporate product with superficial differences. What frustrated loyalists most was that the convergence felt deliberate. Bentley's history, especially its roaring successes in the 1920s and 30s, had created a mythology of a brand born from competition, courage, and engineering grit. The S1, however, behaved like a car engineered to erase any trace of that myth. Its mechanical components, chassis layout, suspension setup, and overall driving character were nearly identical to the Silver Cloud. The steering response, once a Bentley signature, leaned toward the slow and cushioned feedback Rolls-Royce preferred. The suspension, instead of being tuned for engaging road feel, was engineered for near-floating comfort. Even the gear ratios, power delivery, and handling dynamics supported the chauffeur-driven experience rather than the eager, driver-controlled style Bentley owners cherished. Many who test drove the S1 felt as if the company had prioritized silence over sensation, softness over precision, and predictability over personality. The car behaved impeccably, but in a way that almost offended enthusiasts who wanted a Bentley to feel like a machine with a pulse rather than a velvet-lined bubble. The aesthetic similarities only added fuel to the frustration. The shared body design, aside from Bentley's matrix grille and badging, was nearly indistinguishable from its Rolls-Royce sibling. Critics joked that Bentley had become nothing more than a silver cloud in disguise, a painful comparison that reflected broader fears about the brand losing its uniqueness. This was not merely a matter of styling. It threatened the emotional bond that Bentley owners had with the mark. Driving a Bentley had once been a statement that one valued performance as much as luxury. But driving an S1 looked, to many, like admitting one simply wanted a Rolls-Royce but preferred a slightly sportier badge. The sense of betrayal was amplified by the perception that Bentley was no longer trying to differentiate its engineering or philosophy. Owners who attempted to defend the S1 often found themselves outnumbered by purists who argued that the car's refinement came at the cost of its soul. Magazines of the time noted the similarities between the two vehicles with almost uncomfortable politeness, as if afraid to publicly acknowledge how blurred the line had become. The S1 thus became the embodiment of a corporate strategy that viewed the two brands as interchangeable shells rather than carriers of distinct heritage. Ultimately, the anger toward the S1 similarity to the Silver Cloud stemmed from far more than cosmetic resemblance. It was the emotional realization that Bentley, once a brand defined by daring individuality, was being slowly absorbed into a homogenized vision of luxury where identity mattered less than efficiency. The S1 became the moment when many enthusiasts felt Bentley had surrendered its independence, not through mechanical failure or design missteps, but through the quiet erosion of purpose. In their eyes, Bentley had not only started to look like Rolls-Royce, it had begun to think like Rolls-Royce, and that shift created a wound that would take decades to heal. The disappointment surrounding the Bentley S1 grew even sharper when enthusiasts experienced the car behind the wheel and realized just how dramatically its driving character had shifted away from the spirited heritage that had once defined the brand. Bentley had always been revered for building luxury cars that still felt eager, athletic, and mechanically communicative, vehicles that encouraged fast touring, rewarded skilled driving, and carried echoes of the brand's racing pedigree in everything from steering feedback to throttle response. But the S1 behaved nothing like the lively Bentleys that came before. Instead of the taut suspension, responsive steering, and firm road feel that loyalists expected, the S1 delivered an extremely cushioned, floaty, and almost eerily isolated driving experience. Every component seemed to function with the single-minded goal of hiding the road from the driver rather than connecting them to it. The steering grew lighter and slower, requiring far more rotation to navigate bends, which made the car feel detached even at moderate speeds. The suspension, tuned for Rolls-Royce levels of comfort, absorbed bumps so effortlessly that the driver could no longer sense the texture of the road or feel the chassis settle into corners. What many owners described was not a Bentley that wanted to be pushed, but a Bentley that wanted to be chauffeured. This shift in driving personality was more than a change in engineering philosophy. It felt like an identity crisis unfolding in real time. Enthusiasts who had cherished the older Bentleys for their muscular confidence suddenly found themselves piloting a machine that resisted spirited driving, as though the car itself disapproved of being hurried. Instead of inviting the driver to explore its capabilities, the S1 behaved politely, almost stubbornly, as if urging him to slow down and enjoy the scenery rather than carve through it. Even the engine, a smooth-running straight-six carried over from earlier models, felt muted in character because the car's weight, gearing, and refinement restrained its previously enthusiastic nature. The S1 accelerated respectably, but without the immediacy or sense of power delivery that Bentley owners associate with the marque. Every motion felt softened, filtered, and carefully managed, leaving the driver with a sense that the car was prioritizing decorum over engagement. This transformation was particularly painful because it contradicted everything Bentley had once prized. The founders and early Bentley boys believed a luxury car should deliver not only comfort but also excitement, a willingness to surge forward, lean into corners, and give its driver a sense of mastery over mechanical forces. Yet the S1 seemed engineered to remove any hint of athletic drama, replacing it with serene glide more suited to a rear seat passenger than someone holding the wheel. Critics argue that Bentley had abandoned its sporting DNA in favor of Rolls-Royce values, and the S1 became Exhibit A in that argument. Driving enthusiasts describe it as too soft, too insulated, too polite, and too unwilling to communicate. Qualities that might have been virtues in a Rolls-Royce but felt like a betrayal coming from Bentley. What made matters worse was that Bentley did not publicly acknowledge this shift. Instead, the brand marketed the S1 as a natural evolution, more modern, more refined, more luxurious, while ignoring the fact that it had sacrificed much of the energy and character that defined earlier models. Loyalists found themselves wondering whether Bentley still understood what made a Bentley special or whether the company had fully surrendered to the Rolls-Royce philosophy of silent, detached motoring. For those who adored the raw, confident feel of a true driver's Bentley, the S1 was not merely a disappointment. It was an unmistakable symbol that the brand had turned its back on them. Another major source of resentment toward the Bentley S1 came from the realization that the car represented not only a philosophical shift, but also the culmination of Bentley's diminishing independence under Rolls-Royce ownership. This loss of autonomy, which had been creeping in slowly since the early 1930s, became unmistakable with the S1 because the car openly displayed the consequences of corporate consolidation in its design, engineering, and identity. For many passionate Bentley enthusiasts, the S1 wasn't just a car. It was a physical manifestation of a takeover finally reaching full maturity. Earlier models like the Mark VI and R-Type had still retained a semblance of individuality, with Bentley tuning, Bentley styling, and the intangible Bentley feel present beneath the surface. But the S1 felt like the moment when Bentley ceased to be the adventurous younger sibling and became merely a badge within a larger luxury conglomerate. Its design decisions were governed less by Bentley's original ethos of bold engineering and more by Rolls-Royce's strict standards of refinement, cost efficiency, and brand unification. Collectors and historians often remarked that the S1 was the first Bentley that felt as though its personality had been planned by committee rather than crafted by passionate engineers. The company that once prided itself on pushing boundaries now seemed constrained by corporate strategy. Even small details like the weight distribution, suspension calibration, and engine refinement reflected priority shifts that favored Rolls-Royce sensibilities. Bentley's legendary sporting character, cultivated from years of competition and innovation, took a backseat to the larger corporation's desire for consistency between its two marques. What many found heartbreaking was that Bentley engineers of the era likely still harbored ambitions for more dynamic performance, but those visions would have been overruled or heavily restricted by a management team focused on maintaining Rolls-Royce's dominance as the pinnacle of quiet luxury. The S1 thus embodied a kind of muted engineering, brilliance held back by corporate caution. This corporate influence extended into how the car was marketed and positioned publicly. Rather than celebrating Bentley's unique heritage, advertising materials for the S1 emphasized comfort, elegance, smoothness, and other qualities far more aligned with Rolls-Royce ideology than Bentley's history of speed and strength. It felt as if Bentley had been rebranded not as a performance luxury marque, but as an alternative flavor of Rolls-Royce. Even longtime customers noticed that showroom experiences differed. Salesmen no longer highlighted Bentley's sporting lineage, but instead pitched the S1 as a refined chauffeur-capable saloon for buyers wanting subtlety instead of ostentation. This reinforced the painful perception that Bentley was no longer designing cars for drivers but for passengers, a direct contradiction to the dynamic, owner-driver culture that had once made Bentley appealing. Enthusiasts who followed the brand's evolution saw the S1 as a tipping point where Bentley's identity risked dissolving altogether. In their eyes, Rolls-Royce ownership had finally completed a process they had long feared. The transformation of Bentley into a badge-engineered counterpart that existed merely to fill a slightly different niche in the same product strategy. The S1 became a symbol of the moment Bentley's institutional voice was muted, its engineering philosophy diluted, and its heritage overshadowed by a parent company focused on luxury uniformity over mechanical personality. For those who cherish Bentley as a brand built on boldness, independence, and the spirit of motorsport, the S1 represented not just a departure, but a heartbreaking loss, a reminder that even the strongest legacies can be reshaped when individuality gives way to corporate control. The dislike for the Bentley S1 intensified even further when owners and enthusiasts began confronting the vehicle's sheer size and weight, which dramatically altered the driving experience and contributed to a sense that Bentley had abandoned the athleticism that once defined it. Earlier Bentleys, whether the Derby models of the 1930s or the post-war Mark VI and R-Type, were substantial cars, but they carried their mass with a certain poise, balancing luxury with a lively mechanical spirit that gave the impression of a car eager to move. The S1, however, took a significant step toward the stately, almost monumental presence associated with Rolls-Royce limousines. Its expanded dimensions, thicker structural components, larger interior volumes, and more comprehensive sound insulation all contributed to a curb weight that fundamentally shifted how the car behaved. From the driver's seat, the S1 felt undeniably heavier, more deliberate in its movements, and noticeably slower to respond, especially during spirited driving or rapid directional changes. Instead of encouraging confidence, the added mass created a sensation of cautiousness, as though the car needed time to gather itself before executing any maneuver more demanding than a gentle turn or a smooth acceleration. This weight issue wasn't merely a matter of performance numbers. It affected the emotional experience of driving. Bentley had long been known for creating machines that felt capable, muscular, and willing, vehicles that communicated through the chassis and rewarded assertive inputs. But the S1's added bulk dampened that dialogue. Steering inputs required more wheel rotation. The body leaned more through corners, and braking distances lengthened due to the increased mass. Even with generous power from its straight-six engine, the car's acceleration felt restrained, more like a dignified glide than the brisk surge owners expected from Bentley. Enthusiasts often describe the sensation as driving something grand rather than something alive. The weight didn't simply slow the car, it muted its personality. It turned every action into a graceful but distant gesture, where the driver felt like an overseer rather than an active participant. Those who had fallen in love with Bentley for its dynamic prowess felt particularly disillusioned, viewing the S1 as a car designed not to be driven with enthusiasm, but to be admired from the outside or enjoyed from the back seat. The increase in body size also changed the car's aesthetics in ways that frustrated longtime admirers. Bentley's earlier models often combined elegance with a purposeful stance, sleek proportions, elongated bonnets, and athletic lines that hinted at the power beneath the surface. The S1, with its broader body, higher belt line, and more upright presence, projected an image of stateliness rather than speed. The design communicated serenity and prestige, but it lacked the visual tension that made previous Bentleys look ready to surge forward at any moment. To many purists, the S1 looked less like a gentleman's high-performance tourer and more like a formal saloon intended for heads of state. This aesthetic shift symbolized a philosophical transformation. Bentley was no longer trying to express dynamism or sporting intent through its proportions. It was aligning itself visually with Rolls-Royce's emphasis on grandeur and formality. Adding to the frustration was the fact that the increased size and weight were not accompanied by meaningful performance upgrades. The engine, though smooth and reliable, had not evolved significantly to compensate for the heavier chassis, leading many to conclude that Bentley had prioritized comfort and refinement at the expense of engineering balance. Critics argued that the S1 was carrying more mass than its drivetrain and suspension were originally optimized for, resulting in a car that felt competent but uninspired, capable but never thrilling. This imbalance reinforced a narrative that Bentley was drifting away from its performance-driven heritage and being reshaped into a softer, more passive brand. Ultimately, the S1 size and weight contributed to a broader sense of disillusionment, an emotional realization that Bentley was no longer building cars that want to be driven fast, pushed hard, or tested by an enthusiastic driver. Instead, the S1 felt like a machine built for comfort, ceremony, and quiet prestige. For many Bentley purists, this was the moment the brand's heartbeat grew quieter. Its muscular confidence softened, and its identity blurred into something indistinguishable from the values of its corporate parent. Another factor that intensified resentment toward the Bentley S1 was the realization that the car's engine, though beautifully smooth and impeccably refined, no longer embodied the mechanical character that Bentley loyalists had grown to love. Bentley's earlier engines had a distinctive personality. They were torquey, responsive, and full of quiet but unmistakable muscularity. Whether it was the famous straight sixes of the Derby era or the post-war F-head units, these engines felt purposeful, like they were built not just for elegance but for effortless speed and long-distance authority. The S1 retained a version of the straight six that had served Bentley well, but in the context of the new car's heavier body, softer dynamics, and increased refinement, the engine felt less like a source of power and more like a subdued servant operating behind layers of insulation. Enthusiasts noticed immediately that the once iconic Bentley engine note, a subtle growl under load, a confident hum at speed, had been toned down almost to absence. The engine was so quiet, so smoothed out, and so shielded from the cabin that it no longer communicated with the driver in the way earlier Bentleys had. What had once felt like a living mechanical presence now behaved like a polite whisper, efficient but emotionally distant. Adding to this frustration was the fact that the engine's output had not meaningfully increased to compensate for the S1's larger size and greater mass. While Rolls-Royce engineering philosophy had always prioritized smoothness over raw power, Bentley enthusiasts expected something more assertive, an engine tuned for acceleration, strength, and the thrill of commanding a high-performance saloon. Instead, the S1 offered what critics described as adequate performance, a phrase that felt like an insult to a brand built on decades of engineering ambition. Acceleration remained graceful but unexciting, and the car's ability to surge forward on a motorway no longer carried the same commanding energy that defined earlier Bentleys. The lack of stronger performance was particularly disappointing because it symbolized a broader philosophical shift. Bentley was no longer trying to outpace expectations or challenge competitors. It was settling into a comfortable middle ground that prioritized refinement over exhilaration. The engine's evolving character also reflected a deeper emotional loss, the fading of Bentley's sporting identity. Earlier Bentleys had engines that encouraged long-distance motoring, high-speed touring, and spirited driving on winding roads, activities that defined the Bentley legend and created a strong bond between car and driver. But the S1's engine, muted and domesticated, no longer supported the kind of dynamic experiences that made Bentley ownership thrilling. Many owners describe the S1 as feeling overly calm, as though the car had been engineered to avoid excitement entirely. Even when pressed, the engine delivered its power in such a controlled, softened manner that drivers felt insulated rather than engaged. The result was a car that could move swiftly but never dramatically, a machine that denied its driver the emotional satisfaction that had once been a hallmark of the marque. This change in engine character also highlighted Bentley's growing alignment with Rolls-Royce engineering principles. Rolls-Royce famously avoided publishing horsepower figures, insisting that their engines produced adequate power. Bentley, historically more forthcoming and more performance-oriented, now seemed to adopt the same tone. For many purists, this was not just a technical shift, but a symbolic one, confirming their fear that Bentley's future would be dictated by Rolls-Royce values rather than its own heritage. The S1's engine embodied this transition perfectly. It was competent but cautious, powerful but deliberately restrained, refined but devoid of the spark that once made Bentley engines feel special. Ultimately, what enthusiasts mourned was not merely horsepower, it was personality. The S1's engine marked a moment when Bentley's mechanical soul began to feel quiet, controlled, and corporate. The visceral thrill that once defined the brand had been softened into something polite and predictable. For a marque known for courage, speed, and performance-driven luxury, this felt like an unmistakable step away from its roots and a powerful reason why many came to resent the S1 as the Bentley that lost its voice. Another layer of frustration surrounding the Bentley S1 came from the way its interior, though undeniably luxurious, marked a departure from the intimate, handcrafted atmosphere that Bentley owners had associated with earlier models. Bentley cabins had traditionally struck a rare balance. They were opulent, yes, but they also conveyed a sense of purpose and craftsmanship that reflected the brand's sporting roots. The woodwork felt sculpted rather than polished. The leather felt aged through quality rather than pampered to perfection. The instrumentation was straightforward, mechanical, and driver-focused. In earlier Bentleys, the interior invited you to sit behind the wheel as an active participant in the car's behavior. With the S1, however, the interior signaled a shift toward Rolls-Royce's philosophy of turning the cabin into a cocoon, an environment designed not to energize the driver but to soothe them. The wood panels were mirror polished to the point of being decorative rather than functional. The seats were designed for plush comfort rather than supportive engagement, and the sound insulation was so extensive that almost all mechanical feedback was removed from the driving experience. While these elements were unquestionably beautiful, they also created a sense of emotional distance between driver and machine, making the S1 feel more like a luxury lounge than a sporting grand tourer. This transformation was particularly disheartening for owners who had cherished the tactile qualities of older Bentleys. In the S1, switches, knobs, and gauges had a softer, more refined action that lacked the satisfying mechanical resistance previously associated with the marque. Earlier Bentleys had controls that felt engineered for longevity. Thick levers, robust toggles, and purposeful instrumentation that made the driver feel connected to the engineering beneath the surface. The S1's interior, by contrast, embraced a gentler aesthetic philosophy. Surfaces were smoother, movement subdued, and everything communicated an intentional avoidance of drama. Even the driving position contributed to this shift. Where earlier Bentleys positioned the driver with a commanding sense of engagement and road awareness, the S1's softer seating and more isolated cabin created a feeling of detachment, as though the car preferred the driver to relax rather than command. This was not a flaw in craftsmanship. If anything, the S1's interior materials and workmanship were among the finest Bentley had ever produced, but it represented a profound philosophical pivot. What troubled many enthusiasts was that the new interior ambience seemed designed for passengers rather than drivers. Bentley had always marketed itself as a driver's luxury car, powerful, involving, and rewarding to those who took the wheel. But the S1's cabin, with its hushed quiet, ultra-soft seating, and chauffeur-friendly ergonomics, hinted that Bentley was now courting owners who might spend as much time in the rear seats as the front. This was a value system that aligned perfectly with Rolls-Royce's clientele, but stood in stark contrast to Bentley's historic appeal. Loyalists saw the shift as Bentley abandoning its traditional audience in favor of a more general luxury market, diluting the brand's spirit in the process. Additionally, the new design ethos created a paradox. The S1's interior was objectively more comfortable, more luxurious, and more refined than anything Bentley had offered before, yet it felt less Bentley than ever. The details were impeccable, the handcrafted veneers, the deep carpets, the carefully stitched hides, but they catered to a vision of luxury that prioritized stillness over involvement. For many long-time owners, this made the S1's interior feel almost too perfect, too silent, too detached. The charm of Bentley had always come from its blend of elegance and mechanical authenticity, but the S1's cabin was so polished that it erased the sense of being a machine with power and personality. In the end, the S1's interior symbolized a broader existential shift. It was the moment Bentley crossed from being a maker of luxurious sporting cars into a maker of luxurious refined cars. And while this evolution appealed to some new customers, it alienated many of the brand's most devoted followers. The S1 may have offered one of the finest luxury interiors of its time, but for Bentley purists, it marked the beginning of the end of the brand's distinctive soul, a quiet, beautifully upholstered betrayal hidden beneath layers of leather and wood. A further source of bitterness toward the Bentley S1 emerged from the widespread belief that the car's refinement, while technically impressive, came at the direct expense of character, excitement, and emotional connection. Bentley had always occupied a rare space in the luxury car world. Its vehicles blended elegance with a sense of mechanical honesty, offering owners a tactile joy of hearing, feeling, and commanding a powerful machine. But the S1, engineered with obsessive attention to silence and smoothness, effectively removed the sensory dialogue that had once defined the Bentley experience. Almost every vibration was dampened, every sound muted, every interaction softened until the driver could scarcely perceive the mechanical life beneath the car's polished surfaces. To many purists, this hyper-refinement felt less like progress and more like erasure, the deliberate smoothing away of everything that made a Bentley feel alive. The S1 glided beautifully, of course, but in doing so it separated the driver from the road in a way that felt foreign, even disorienting compared to the brand's earlier offerings. This detachment was especially noticeable in situations where drivers expected the car to respond with urgency or texture. On winding country roads, territory where pre-war and early post-war Bentleys had excelled, the S1 felt reluctant and distant, as though the car were wrapped in an invisible layer of velvet. Steering feedback was softened to the point of near numbness, providing little sense of grip or road surface. The suspension floated over imperfections, but offered so little body control that enthusiastic driving fell out of place, or even inappropriate. Even the accelerator pedal, once a channel through which Bentley drivers could feel the engine's eagerness, now delivered power in a gentle, carefully regulated wave that lacked the satisfying immediacy of the past. Critics argued that this refinement was not an improvement, but a contradiction. A Bentley that discouraged spirited driving had lost one of the core values that made the badge desirable. What made matters worse was the unavoidable impression that this detachment was intentional. Bentley engineers, now heavily influenced by Rolls-Royce philosophy, were clearly designing the S1 to conform to a vision of luxury where isolation was considered the highest achievement. Silence was interpreted as sophistication, softness as superiority, and lack of feedback as elegance. Yet these virtues, celebrated in Rolls-Royce automobiles, conflicted with Bentley's legacy. It created a strange experience for longtime Bentley owners. The more luxurious the S1 became, the less Bentley-like it felt. Refinement, instead of elevating the car, seemed to wash away its personality. Many compared the S1 to a perfectly engineered musical instrument that had been tuned to produce no sound. Technically impressive, but emotionally hollow. This pervasive calmness also led to an unexpected psychological disconnect. Owners reported that driving the S1 could feel almost too serene, too insulated, as though the car removed them from the act of driving rather than enhancing it. In earlier Bentleys, the driver felt like part of the machine, influencing its behavior and enjoying the subtle conversation between man, road, and metal. But the S1 denied that conversation. It placed the driver in a beautifully furnished bubble where nothing urgent or visceral ever occurred. While this sensation appealed to some buyers, especially those more aligned with Rolls-Royce tastes, it alienated enthusiasts who believed a Bentley should stir emotion, not suppress it. Ultimately, this loss of character became one of the most frequently cited criticisms of the S1. It was a car that excelled in refinement yet failed in identity, a machine that demonstrated technical mastery but lacked the intangible spark that made earlier Bentleys beloved. By prioritizing calmness over connection, Bentley inadvertently created a car that loyalists respected but could not adore. The S1 became a symbol of what happens when perfection is pursued so intensely that personality disappears, a reminder that even the most luxurious ride can feel empty if it no longer speaks to the heart of its driver. Another major point of frustration among Bentley loyalists was the way the S1 dramatically shifted the relationship between Bentley owners and the broader motoring public. For decades, Bentleys had commanded a unique kind of respect, one rooted not just in wealth or status, but in the brand's undeniable performance pedigree, motorsport victories, and reputation for building fast, durable cars for discerning driver owners. Earlier Bentleys drew admiration because they embodied a blend of elegance and engineering courage. They signaled that the driver behind the wheel valued both luxury and the thrill of mastery over a powerful machine. But the S1, with its subdued performance, softened dynamics, and increasingly Rolls-Royce-like character, changed that public perception. Instead of being recognized as a car for spirited drivers or individuals with a taste for engineering excellence, the S1 was increasingly seen as a car for passengers, particularly wealthy individuals who preferred to be chauffeured. This shift in image deeply wounded Bentley enthusiasts who felt that the brand's public identity was unraveling in front of them. The S1's imposing size, silenced cabin, and graceful but unassertive demeanor contributed to an impression that it was meant not for the open road, but for ceremonial arrivals. Onlookers no longer saw a Bentley as a choice of a confident driver who enjoyed fast touring. Rather, they saw a symbol of quiet wealth, indistinguishable in purpose from a Rolls-Royce silver cloud. This change was reinforced by the fact that the S1's visual profile was nearly identical to its Rolls-Royce counterpart, making it easy for the public to conflate the two. For a brand that built its identity on separation, Bentley as a sporting alternative to Rolls-Royce's pure luxury, This convergence in public perception felt like a painful loss. Owners who had once taken pride in explaining how their Bentley differed dramatically from a Rolls-Royce now found themselves confronted with puzzled looks and comments suggesting the cars were basically the same. What had once been a badge that announced distinction had become one that sparked confusion. The changed public reaction also diminished the emotional satisfaction of ownership. Many Bentley enthusiasts loved the brand precisely because it wasn't ostentatious in a loud or flashy sense. Instead, it commanded admiration from those who knew cars and understood Bentley's engineering and sporting heritage. But with the arrival of the S1, admiration shifted toward a more superficial form, less about mechanical prowess and more about the car's imposing presence and luxury aura. To purists, this felt like a hollowed-out form of respect, disconnected from the characteristics that had historically made Bentley ownership meaningful. They no longer felt recognized as drivers. They felt categorized as wealthy consumers. This shift also affected how Bentley owners interacted with one another. In earlier decades, Bentley ownership often came with a sense of camaraderie, forged through shared appreciation, performance, long-distance driving, and the brand's storied past. Owners would gather at rallies, tours, and club events not just to display their cars, but to drive them vigorously, to celebrate their engineering integrity. But with the S1's arrival, gatherings took on a different tone. Conversations shifted from discussing handling nuances and engine tuning to admiring interior finishes and debating chauffeur amenities. The emphasis moved from driving to being driven, a cultural shift that alienated enthusiasts who cherished Bentley's historic ethos. Perhaps the most painful part of this changing public perception was that it wasn't based on misunderstanding alone. It reflected the reality of Bentley's evolving philosophy. Bentley was no longer producing cars for the same type of owner, and the S1 made that clear. Instead of being admired for speed and mechanical feel, the S1 was respected for calmness, grace, and its near-silent ride. To many long-term followers of the brand, this felt like watching a beloved athlete abandon their sport to pursue something entirely different. The world continued to admire Bentley, but for the wrong reasons that had nothing to do with the passion and energy that once defined the mark. In this way, the S1 not only changed how Bentley drivers were seen by others, but also how they saw themselves. It altered the social and emotional landscape of ownership, replacing pride and performance with a more generic prestige of wealth. For many, this was one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the S1 era. The realization that Bentley, once admired as a driver's luxury mark, had lost a public identity that made it special. Another deep source of resentment arose from the way the Bentley S1 seemed to sever the emotional lineage connecting Bentley's proud racing past with its modern road cars. For enthusiasts who cherish the stories of the Bentley boys, the fearless racers who dominated Le Mans in the 1920s and built the brand's mythos through grit, innovation, and audacity, the S1 felt like an unrecognizable descendant, a car adrift from its heritage. Bentley's earlier road models had always carried subtle echoes of those racing victories. The purposeful stance, the mechanical honesty, the inherent sense that underneath the luxury, there lived a machine engineered for endurance and speed. Even in the post-war era, the Mark VI and R-Type Continental preserved some of that lineage, offering not just comfort, but also genuine capability and a thrilling sense of possibility. The S1, however, seemed to erase these values almost completely. Its softened dynamics, softened image, and softened personality created a jarring disconnect from everything Bentley had once symbolized. It wasn't just that the S1 wasn't a racer. It was that it didn't feel like it came from a brand that had ever raced at all. This emotional severing felt especially painful because it arrived at a time when other premium manufacturers were leaning more heavily into their performance heritage. Jaguar was winning accolades on track with the D-Type and reinforcing its sporting identity on the road. Even Mercedes-Benz, recovering from the war, had revived its reputation with the stunning 300 SL Gullwing, a car that shouted engineering ambition from every angle. Against this backdrop, Bentley's S1 looked timid, conservative, and almost embarrassed by the idea of performance. Admirers who valued Bentley's motorsport DNA felt as though the brand had stepped back from the global automotive stage just as its competitors were stepping forward with bold innovations and racing partnerships. Bentley, in their eyes, was retreating into the safety of corporate luxury while other marques continued to cultivate excitement and engineering bravado. For many purists, this disconnect felt like a betrayal of the very people who had built the Bentley legacy. The Bentley boys had risked everything on the track, forging a reputation that made Bentley synonymous with speed, stamina, and resilience. Their exploits weren't just history. They were the soul of the brand. When enthusiasts drove earlier Bentleys, they could still sense traces of that spirit. The strong torque delivery, the confident suspension tuning, the solid steering feel that encouraged spirited driving. But the S1 offered no such reminders. Instead of celebrating Bentley's past, it seemed determined to distance itself from it. The car's engineering philosophy, visual presentation, and refined road manners all communicated a departure from edge, daring, and mechanical excitement. Bentley's previous tagline, the silent sports car, had lost its meaning. The S1 was silent, yes, but it was no longer a sports car in any sense that mattered emotionally. This felt particularly tragic because Bentley's heritage wasn't merely a marketing narrative. It was a story that had shaped generations of loyalists. Clubs, tours, rallies, and gatherings were filled with people whose fascination with Bentley stemmed directly from brand's extraordinary past. They admired cars that had personality and courage, machines that blended luxury with capability in a way no other marque could match. These owners didn't just collect Bentleys. They preserved them, raced them, repaired them, and wrote about them with unshakable devotion. To those passionate custodians of Bentley history, the S1 represented the moment when the brand stopped honoring its roots. It felt like a car designed for people who knew nothing of Bentley's past and cared even less. Perhaps the most painful part of this emotional disconnect was the realization that Bentley itself seemed willing to let go of its heritage. The company's marketing materials from the S1 era rarely mentioned racing, athleticism, or engineering prowess. Instead, they emphasized quietness, comfort, and the prestige of ownership. The entire narrative shifted from performance to serenity, from driver engagement to effortless transportation. And while this messaging appealed to a new class of buyers seeking understated luxury, it alienated a loyal core who believed Bentley's greatness came from blending refinement with racing-born capability. In their eyes, the S1 symbolized not just a new direction, but a conscious abandonment of the spirit that had made Bentley legendary. In this sense, the S1 became a car that unintentionally wounded the very audience that kept Bentley's legacy alive for decades. It stood as a reminder that brands, especially those under corporate ownership, can forget their own story in pursuit of new markets. For enthusiasts, the emotional break between Bentley and its motorsport heritage was not a matter of nostalgia alone. It was a loss of identity, a silencing of the spirit that had once defined every Bentley on the road. Another frustration surrounding the Bentley S1 stemmed from the way it altered the ownership experience itself, making maintenance, repairs, and everyday operation feel less like the intimate, enthusiastic engagement Bentley drivers were accustomed to and more like a distant, procedural luxury obligation. Earlier Bentleys, though complex and finely engineered, had been designed with philosophy that rewarded attentive owners. Their mechanical layouts, though intricate, invited understanding. The engines responded to proper tuning. The suspension rewarded precision adjustments, and the driving characteristics subtly improved under the care of someone who knew the car's temperament. Many Bentley loyalists took pride in this bond between owner and machine. They weren't mechanics, but they appreciated how their involvement, checking fluids, understanding carburation, feeling the car's responses, enhanced the driving experience and strengthened their emotional connection with the vehicle. The S1, however, felt like a machine sealed off from such engagement. Its refinement and insulation, once praised as engineering achievements, now created a barrier that separated the owner from the mechanical heart of the car. This increased distance was partly due to the S1's engineering philosophy, which prioritized smoothness and silence over mechanical accessibility. Many components were tucked deeper behind panels, insulated layers, or more complex assemblies that made casual inspection difficult. Even routine tasks that had once been part of the Bentley driver's ritual now required specialized tools or professional servicing. The engine bay, though beautifully arranged, no longer encouraged hands-on familiarity. The car seemed almost to discourage owners from tinkering, reinforcing the idea that a Bentley was something to be observed, not interacted with. For loyalists accustomed to understanding and even bonded with their car through maintenance, This shift felt alien and unwelcome. It contributed to the perception that the S1 was designed for passive owners, those who wanted the prestige but not the involvement. The financial aspect of ownership also became more complicated. As Bentley drifted closer to Rolls-Royce in engineering and philosophy, the cost of maintaining the S1 rose accordingly. Specialized service, new maintenance protocols, and more refined mechanical components made upkeep significantly more expensive. Skilled independent mechanics who had years of experience working on earlier Bentleys found the S1 less intuitive, less open to adjustment, and more tightly engineered around Rolls-Royce's standards of long-term dependability through controlled dealer servicing. For many loyalists, this shift changed the ownership dynamic from one of partnership to dependency. They felt increasingly reliant on authorized workshops, which not only strained budgets, but also stripped away the sense of personal stewardship that had historically been part of the Bentley experience. Adding to the frustration was the fact that these costs did not come with a corresponding increase in dynamic capability or performance. If anything, maintaining the S1 felt disproportionately expensive for a car that no longer offered the sporting character Bentley owners valued. The brand's traditional enthusiasts found themselves paying Rolls-Royce-level maintenance fees for a car that behaved and responded nothing like the Bentleys they previously cherished. This imbalance reinforced the sense that Bentley was becoming less of a driver's mark and more of a luxury commodity. The S1 also made ownership more impersonal in a cultural sense. Earlier Bentleys had thriving communities of mechanically savvy owners who exchanged knowledge, helped each other troubleshoot quirks, and built a culture of mutual respect grounded in shared passion. The S1, however, attracted a newer demographic, wealthy buyers who valued the car for its comfort and prestige rather than its engineering and performance. This cultural divide created tension within Bentley clubs and gatherings. Old guard owners felt a loss of camaraderie, noticing that S1 drivers often had little interest in the marque's heritage or technical nuances. The shared rituals of maintenance, tuning, and spirited touring were replaced with a quieter, more formal style of ownership that lacked the warmth and enthusiasm of earlier eras. Even the driving experience contributed to this sense of detachment. In older Bentleys, long journeys fostered understanding between driver and machine. One learned the sound of the engine under load, the way the chassis settled at speed, the subtle cues that signaled when the car was happiest. The S1, designed to eliminate noise and tactile feedback, removed these cues entirely. Owners found themselves driving a machine that offered no mechanical dialogue, no subtle reminders of the engineering beneath the surface. It was luxurious, yes, but emotionally mute, a vehicle that transported rather than collaborated. For many Bentley loyalists, this was the final confirmation that the S1 represented a philosophical break not just in design or performance, but in the very nature of ownership. It changed the brand from something that rewarded passion, involvement, and mechanical curiosity into something that expected passive admiration and professional upkeep. The result was a car that felt farther away from its owners, an exquisitely crafted object that demanded respect but offered little emotional reciprocity. This detachment made many enthusiasts feel as though Bentley had not only changed what its cars were, but who they were meant for, reinforcing the belief that the S1 was the point where the connection between Bentley and its most devoted followers began to dissolve. Another reason the Bentley S1 became such a polarizing and even resented model was the sense among enthusiasts that Bentley, during the S1 era, had begun prioritizing commercial pragmatism over engineering daring, effectively diluting the brand's exclusivity and mystique. In earlier decades, Bentley production numbers were low not merely because of limited demand, but because Bentley's philosophy demanded that each car be crafted as a piece of engineering art, slow to build, expensive to perfect, and uncompromising in detail. Buyers felt they were part of a small, discerning circle of individuals who appreciated a blend of luxury and sporting purpose that no other manufacturer could replicate. But with the S1, Bentley, under Rolls-Royce management, shifted decisively toward larger-scale, standardized production. The standard steel Saloon body allowed higher output, faster assembly, and more predictable cost structures. While this made the car more commercially viable, it also made it feel less exclusive, less rare, and less special. For a brand whose identity was built on rarity and distinction, this shift struck many devoted followers as a cheapening of the marque's legacy. This sense of dilution was amplified by how uniform the S1 lineup became. Whereas earlier Bentleys offered vast variation through coach-built designs, bespoke orders, and mechanical configurations tailored to buyers' preferences, the S1 offered comparatively little individuality. Buyers were presented with a body shape shared across nearly all examples and an interior layout that, while luxurious, differed only in choice of veneer or upholstery tone. The purchasing experience became more transactional and less collaborative. Instead of commissioning a one-on-one automobile shaped by artisans interpreting a client's desires, owners were now selecting from predetermined options within a rigidly controlled factory system. For many purists, this removed much of the emotional depth that had once characterized Bentley ownership. They were no longer curators of rolling artistry. They were simply purchasers of a refined product. This standardization also influenced the social fabric of Bentley ownership. Previously, each Bentley was a conversation piece, an artifact of personal taste and bespoke craftsmanship. Owners took pride in knowing their car had unique proportions, distinctive lines, or an interior configuration no other car on earth shared. Coach-built Bentleys sparked curiosity and admiration wherever they appeared because they were unmistakably personal. With the S1, however, many cars looked identical, creating an aesthetic sameness that fell out of place for a brand built on individuality. It became increasingly difficult for owners to feel a deep personal connection to their car when thousands of other examples looked just like it. The S1 was still luxurious, still impeccably finished, but it lacked the sense of intimacy and identity that had once been central to the Bentley experience. Commercial motivations also began to overshadow Bentley's engineering ambitions, which enthusiasts found particularly disheartening. Rolls-Royce management saw the Bentley S1 as part of a unified product line rather than as a platform for innovation. Investment in performance development, distinctive engineering, or racing-inspired advancements dwindled significantly. Instead of pushing boundaries or experimenting with bold new ideas, Bentley became aligned with conservative design philosophy of Rolls-Royce, which valued reliability and refinement above everything else. Enthusiasts recognized that this pivot was not driven by engineering necessity, but by business strategy, by the desire to streamline manufacturing, cut costs, and broaden the appeal of both marques through standardized design. For those who cherished Bentley because of its engineering audacity, this shift felt like a betrayal of the brand's soul. What made this commercial pivot especially painful was a realization that Bentley's historic identity, rooted in adventure, innovation, and individuality, was being systematically replaced by a sanitized, market-friendly vision of luxury. The car was no longer being shaped by the spirit of the Bentley boys or the engineering feats that had defined Bentley's pre-war greatness. It was being shaped by financial logic, by corporate directives, by accountants and strategists rather than by passionate engineers. Owners understood that this shift might ensure Bentley's survival, but they feared it would cost the brand its essence. The S1 became the visible embodiment of that fear. Ultimately, Part 13 reflects the growing belief among loyalists that Bentley was no longer building cars that expressed artistry, uniqueness, or bold ambition. Instead, the brand seemed focused on creating refined, profitable, market-optimized products. The S1 may have been a commercial success, but to purists, it signaled a profound loss. The fading of Bentley's individuality, the blurring of its heritage, and the quiet but unmistakable transformation of a once legendary mark into something safer, more uniform, and far less magical. Another layer of resentment toward the Bentley S1 came from the way it seemed to represent a complete philosophical retreat from innovation, signaling to many enthusiasts that Bentley was no longer interested in pushing boundaries or leading the industry forward. Historically, Bentley had earned its reputation not simply through luxury, but through engineering daring. W.O. Bentley's insistence on powerful, robust engines, the company's bold experiments with high-performance chassis, and its early adoption of technologies aimed at producing cars that were as capable on the open road as they were elegant at rest. Even after Rolls-Royce acquired Bentley, there had been flashes of this spirit in models like the R-Type Continental, which was one of the fastest four-seat cars in the world, and a symbol of what Bentley could be when allowed to innovate. But the S1 seemed to abandon this legacy entirely. It introduced no groundbreaking performance technology, no significant engineering advancements, and no design innovations that set it apart from a conservative corporate counterpart. Instead, it felt like the product of a company content with being safe, happy to follow rather than lead, to blend in rather than stand out. This stagnation was made even more apparent by the rapidly evolving automotive landscape of the mid-1950s. Across Europe, manufacturers were experimenting with bold aerodynamic forms, new lightweight materials, fuel injection systems, disc brakes, and advanced chassis designs. The S1, by comparison, looked and behaved like a car from an earlier decade, graceful, yes, but static, traditional, almost stubbornly resistant to change. Enthusiasts who admired Bentley for its engineering courage were dismayed to see the company fall behind competitors who were embracing modernity with enthusiasm. Bentley, once a pioneer, was now positioned as a follower, adhering to conservative engineering choices that prioritized refinement over advancement. This was particularly painful because Bentley had always been a brand whose greatness rested on ambition and boldness. Watching it settle into a comfortable, risk-averse routine felt like witnessing the dimming of a once brilliant flame. Many also felt that the lack of innovation in the S1 was a symptom of Bentley's increasingly restricted autonomy under Rolls-Royce. Corporate oversight meant that engineers were encouraged to prioritize reliability and uniformity rather than creativity or experimentation. Any idea that introduced engineering risk, cost increases, or the possibility of overshadowing Rolls-Royce was quietly suppressed. As a result, the S1 felt like a car engineered to avoid surprises rather than create them. Loyalists recognized that this wasn't a failure of talent. Bentley's engineers were still among the best in the industry, but rather a failure of philosophy. The brand's leadership no longer valued innovation as a defining element of Bentley's identity, and the S1 became the clearest manifestation of this shift. This was particularly heartbreaking for enthusiasts who saw Bentley as the embodiment of British engineering ambition. The S1, for all its beauty and craftsmanship, felt like a car designed to maintain appearances rather than redefine expectations. It offered comfort instead of capability, silence instead of strength, polish instead of personality. For a brand whose mythos was built on roaring victories at Le Mans, daring feats of endurance, and relentless pursuit of performance excellence, such conservatism felt like surrender. The loss of innovation wasn't merely a technical disappointment. It was an existential one. Enthusiasts feared that the S1 represented not a temporary pause, but a permanent redirection of Bentley's identity toward the safe, predictable, and unremarkable. The emotional impact of this shift was profound. Bentley fans didn't just want luxury. They wanted ambitious luxury, a sense that their car was a product of courageous engineering choices, of designers and engineers who wanted to challenge themselves and the industry. With the S1, that sense evaporated. The car was beautifully made, but lacked the spark of imagination that had once set Bentley apart. It felt like a lesson in restraint rather than celebration of ambition. In the end, what made the absence of innovation so infuriating was not simply that the S1 failed to push the brand forward, but that it actively represented the moment Bentley stopped trying to push forward. It marked a turning point where the marque no longer sought to lead through engineering brilliance, but instead chose to blend into a broader corporate strategy focused on refinement and uniformity. For many enthusiasts, this made the S1 not merely a disappointment, but a symbolic low point. The moment when the pioneering spirit that had defined Bentley's earliest triumphs finally gave way to cautious conformity. Perhaps the deepest and most enduring frustration surrounding the Bentley S1 came from the long-term realization that this car did not merely represent a temporary misstep or a moment of brand confusion, but the beginning of an identity shift whose effects would ripple across Bentley's future for decades. At the time of its release, many loyalists hoped that the S1 was simply a transitional model, an unavoidable product of mid-century corporate strategy that Bentley would eventually overcome as it rediscovered its performance-driven roots. But as the years unfolded, it became clear that the S1 was not a deviation from the brand's direction. It was the new direction. The characteristics enthusiasts disliked most, its detachment, its shared identity with Rolls-Royce, its lack of sporting ambition, its emphasis on being chauffeured, its standardized bodywork, were not anomalies. They became defining traits of Bentley through the late 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The S1 was the first unmistakable signal that Bentley's corporate leadership intended to reshape the marque into a quieter, softer, more formal interpretation of luxury, and this dawning realization left many devotees feeling that the soul of Bentley had been permanently altered. This feeling was compounded by the understanding that once a brand's identity shifts at the foundational level, its engineering philosophy, design priorities, and market positioning. It is extraordinarily difficult to reverse direction. The S1 set a precedent. If Bentley could be transformed into a badge engineer variation of a Rolls-Royce Saloon once, then nothing prevented future models from continuing down the same path. And indeed, Bentley's subsequent cars throughout the era followed the S1's template so closely that the brand's distinctiveness nearly vanished. Enthusiasts looking back saw the S1 as the moment Bentley traded its heritage for convenience, its ambition for safety, and its mechanical personality for market expediency. It wasn't merely a single model they disliked. It was a doorway through which Bentley walked into a future that felt increasingly disconnected from its roots. This created a sense of collective mourning, a sorrow not just for a car, but for a legacy. Even more painful was the realization that the S1 influenced how new generations of buyers understood the Bentley name. Younger enthusiasts coming of age in the 60s and 70s encountered a Bentley that bore little resemblance to the brand that had once conquered Le Mans. Instead of being known for speed, strength, and rugged elegance, Bentley became synonymous with muted luxury and quiet formality, essentially the driver's Rolls-Royce in name only. Many of these younger observers never experienced the visceral thrill that earlier Bentleys offered, and thus never understood why longtime owners were so passionate about what had been lost. The S1 became the car that quietly shifted public perception, rewriting the brand's narrative not through incompetence but through subtle, deliberate redefinition. For purists, this was a heartbreak of a different kind. Not only had the S1 changed Bentley, but it had changed how the world saw Bentley. As decades passed, restoring Bentley's earlier reputation became increasingly difficult. The engineering and design choices introduced during the S1 era solidified into institutional norms. Rolls-Royce's influence permeated multiple generations of Bentleys, turning the marque into a polished, conservative companion rather than a bold, innovative challenger. Enthusiasts often described this transformation as watching a once great athlete slowly lose their competitive fire. Not through injury or defeat, but through polite domestication. The S1 symbolized that turning point, the moment when Bentley stepped away from the racetrack and into the drawing room, content to be admired rather than tested. What makes Part 15 emotionally powerful is the retrospective clarity with which enthusiasts now view the S1. At the time, it was controversial. Over time, it became symbolic. Today, it stands as a historical pivot point, ambitious in refinement but timid in character, meticulously crafted but spiritually adrift. Enthusiasts do not condemn the S1 because it was poorly made. They condemn it because it was too perfectly made in ways that suppressed the personality that once defined Bentley. It represented a choice, a quiet, calculated choice, to prioritize a corporate future over a storied past. In the end, the S1 became the most hated Bentley of the 1950s not because it was a failure, but because it was a success that came at the cost of everything enthusiasts feared losing. It was the moment Bentley stepped onto a path that reshaped its identity for generations. A beautiful, elegant, refined, magnificent automobile that nonetheless marked the slow, painful fading of a brand's original soul.